All right. Hey, welcome back. Appreciate you stopping in. If in fact you are stopping in and listening for a minute. So, coming to the next section in the book of James, right? So we're now into chapter 3. We're in the back half of chapter 3, starting in verse 13 to the end of the chapter. And at this point, James poses a question. And his question is, who is wise and understanding among you? Right? So that's a question that we might consider asking ourselves, right? Hey, who's wise among us, right? And how would we know, right? That's kind of the assumed criteria of James's question. Is there's obviously an answer with some criteria that would understand how to answer, right? And so then James goes to start giving this criteria, and he says, let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom, right? And so here we see that good conduct done in humility or meekness is one of the first criteria that James sets forth as who is wise, right? And so obviously the kind of separator between wisdom and knowledge is applying the knowledge, right? Having a bunch of information in your head that doesn't get lived out and applied in your life is not wisdom. That's just knowledge. And in other places Paul says knowledge puffs up, right? So we want to make sure that we're applying that in our lives. And so as you read through the rest of these verses, James kind of sets forth this comparison contrast of the characteristics of earthly wisdom or man wisdom versus wisdom that comes from God. And on the earthly side, he lists criteria of it being bitter and with envy, self-seeking, leading to confusion and every evil thing, right? And I think one of the reasons why we would include the idea of every evil thing is because these characteristics are done in the flesh. And if we are walking by means of our flesh, that means our sin nature is leading us. And we know from Jeremiah that our heart is deceptive above all else and desperately wicked. And so therefore, if that is what is leading us in our lives, then every evil thing is possible, right? And so on the contrast to that, and you can kind of see this as I was writing out these two lists and kind of seeing as they oppose each other, on the wisdom that comes from above, the characteristics are pure and peaceable, right? And those are kind of the contrast of bitter and envious. And then you have gentle and willing to yield, right? Willing to yield is the counter of self-seeking. And then you have full of mercy and good fruit. And that's the opposite of every evil thing, right? We're either full of every evil thing or we're full of mercy and good fruit. And then he also adds without partiality and without hypocrisy, right? So here's some criteria that we can kind of look to see, hey, how in the way that I'm living my life, in the way that I'm applying the knowledge in my life that I have to either demonstrate wisdom or not wisdom, but even within that confines, is the wisdom I'm demonstrating, is it rooted and grounded in man's wisdom, or is it rooted and grounded in God's wisdom, right? And so here's this criteria that we can kind of look to and see as the litmus test for ourselves as kind of where are we applying. And he says something interesting that caught my eye. He says, let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. And so this assumes the presence of works, right? It doesn't assume that they're good or bad. It just assumes that there are works present. And then the value of those works and how those works are demonstrated, whether they're done in meekness, and right, then we have all the other criteria that kind of put the parameters around the works as to what quality they are, right? And we see in 1 Corinthians 3 where Paul talks about we're going to be, as believers, we will be judged based on the quality of our work, right? And what the motives were and whether or not it was for the right purposes, not for salvation, obviously, but for rewards. And so this is what led me to the next thought is works. We're always doing works, right? Whether we realize it or not, we're always busy. We're always doing things. And those things, think of it this way. When I sometimes teach leadership at work to different, up and coming leaders, I will kind of draw a square on the board, and I will have on one side of the square of 4 quadrants, on the one side you'll have intentional and unintentional, And then on the other scale, you have good and bad behaviors. And so the point is that we're always influencing people. We're always demonstrating some level of influence. And the question is, we're either intentionally doing good or bad, or we're unintentionally doing good or bad by default, just because of our unintentionality. Right, and so I think this idea here is that there's always works being done. We're living our lives, right? People are always observing the things that we do, and we either are going to be intentional or unintentional in that activity. And if we're intentional, then we can choose to be intentionally good and try to be that example and to demonstrate, that Christ-like behavior that's going to have an impact and the correct influence in the people around you. But if you're kind of just coasting in life and you're not really putting much intentional thought into what you do, there's a good chance that you could accidentally just be existing in the unintentionally bad category, right? Where some of the things that we say, some of the things that we do, we're not really taking every thought captive. We're not really paying attention to our words, which James just talked about in the previous verses. And so we can be unintentionally putting out those negative or bad examples, which obviously, comes to its full fruition here in this last bit of this chapter 3, where James is saying that's not wisdom. That comes from God, right? That's earthly wisdom. And so that's just kind of what came to me is this really great contrast that James sets out between earthly wisdom versus godly wisdom. And that, kind of led me into the idea of we always have works. The question is, are we intentional with them, or are we unintentional and just kind of letting things happen as a result of proxy of people just experience our lives and, they get what they get, and we don't even realize what kind of testimony we're leaving. So hopefully this is food for thought, give you something to consider as we have to always decide, are we going to live in the intentional quadrant, or are we going to live in the unintentional quadrant and just let our behavior kind of manifest, sometimes in the spirit, sometimes in the flesh, and just, it is what it is. So hopefully that's food for thought. Have a great rest of your Sunday. Take care.